When Netflix released Cuties, a film glamorizing underage strippers, Rotten Tomatoes gave it an 86% certified fresh rating. But when it came to the audience and actual real people, the show only got a 15% rating. Then when Dave Chappelle came along and said some edgy jokes, he got a 0% score from Rotten Tomatoes. And surprise surprise, he got an audience score of 99%. So why is there such a big difference in these scores? And what's happened to Rotten Tomatoes? Rotten Tomatoes used to be a well-respected site. It was used in marketing, billboards, studios even put their scores in movie posters. If you wanted to know whether a movie was really worth watching, then Rotten Tomatoes could tell you. And this made the site wildly popular. Over time, the site grew to become one of the largest review sites around. However, today, it's a whole other story. Rotten Tomatoes is everything it once stood against. So how did one of the most respected sites on the internet lose all of its reputation in a matter of a couple of years? Well, to understand this, we need to understand what made Rotten Tomatoes so successful in the first place. You see, Rotten Tomatoes isn't unique as a site that aggregates other reviews, but it is unique in how it rates its movies. The system is basically a fancy version of thumbs up, thumbs down. If a movie gets over 60% good reviews, then Rotten Tomatoes will give it a fresh rating. If it gets lower than 60, then it's rotten. But there's a third rating. A movie can be certified fresh if it gets 5 good reviews from top critics, a greater than 75% average rating, and a minimum amount of overall reviews. Through this method, Rotten Tomatoes hopes to give people at least some insight into the quality of a movie. Now, this obviously isn't a perfect system, no method would be. But within this seemingly simple solution lies some massive problems, and the first of these came to light all the way back in 2017. You see, every year there's major blockbuster releases during the summer, and it's these massive movies that the film industry relies on. In fact, they make up 40% of all ticket sales. But when the summer of 2017 came round, there were more misses than hits. Although some films performed well, most were flops. Baywatch bombed, King Arthur bombed, the sequels to the Pirates of the Caribbean and Transformers all bombed, and the summer studios were taking huge hits. But there was one thing that all of these movies had in common: an awful Rotten Tomatoes score. And it was also during this exact same summer that Rotten Tomatoes grew massively, seeing a 32% increase in traffic just compared to the year before. And it didn't take long for the studios to put 2 and 2 together, and soon they were out for blood. Brett Ratner, a director and producer, claimed that Rotten Tomatoes was the destruction of our business, and in a lot of ways he wasn't wrong, as so many people were now relying on the site for prior judgment before purchasing a ticket, and it made people that much more apprehensive about seeing films. No one wanted to waste 2 hours on a film that Rotten Tomatoes deemed bad. And because of the controversy surrounding Rotten Tomatoes' harsh scores, this actually improved Rotten Tomatoes' standing. Seeing it fight against the mediocre and bad drivel that Hollywood tries to shove down people's throats was seemingly refreshing, and the site continued to grow from here. However, within the attacks, there lay some valid criticism for the site, and the first of these was about to make waves. You see, as Rotten Tomatoes was growing, one of the most well-respected people in film would come to completely denounce the site. In fact, Martin Scorsese was one of the biggest critics of the site. In an article on the issues with Rotten Tomatoes, Scorsese called the current way of doing things brutal judgmentalism, where he claimed that the site had taken the actual content and thoughtful criticism out of the picture, instead of replacing it with a system that amounts to a simple yes or no question, where a plethora of insightful opinions and comments are ground down and fed into a machine. And at the end, a number pops out that tells you whether a movie is good or not. Scorsese calls the process insulting, and when films come out that defy easy categorism, the system treats them incredibly unfairly. It slaps them with a bad or rotten rating, discouraging anyone in the public from actually opening themselves up to the experience. And often these films aren't immediately liked, but are later realized to be masterpieces. Scorsese used the example of It's a Wonderful Life and Vertigo to illustrate this. But possibly the last thing that Scorsese says about Rotten Tomatoes has ended up being almost prophetic. You see, the site was incredibly popular in 2017 when the article was written, but Scorsese was foreshadowing that the site wasn't going to stick around for too much longer, and we're witnessing the process unfold before our very eyes. However, back in this time, Rotten Tomatoes was in its golden years, and a year later it seemed like Scorsese was wrong. In fact, they found there was virtually no correlation between Rotten Tomatoes scores and box office numbers. And this was proven the next year, when movie box office numbers skyrocketed to record heights, proving that the site wasn't the problem that people thought it was. But the trouble was that this only really applied when Rotten Tomatoes gave accurate pictures of what people actually liked. In 2017, for example, there was little difference between audience and critic scores. But this would all change in 2018, when certain new reports came out that put Rotten Tomatoes in a very bad light. But before we continue, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Masterworks. In 2022, you can't have all your eggs in one basket, especially as Goldman Sachs just warned the bear market is far from over. And with inflation taking record amounts of money straight from your bank account, people are scrambling for options. Because a groundbreaking McKinsey study found that institutions invest 30 to 50% of their assets into alternatives outside of stocks. And BofA's CIO recommends investing in one specific high-performing alternative to rescue your cash: fine art. Now, it sounds unusual, but after the record-breaking Paul Allen auction last month, CNBC suggested that the ultra-rich may view fine art as a safer store of wealth than even stocks. But it's not just the ultra-rich profiting off of art in 2022. Masterworks' investors have been too. Their paintings are SEC qualified, broken into shares, then resold. When resold, potential profits are redistributed to Masterworks' investors. And just last month, Masterworks handed back a 17.8% net return, their fifth sale this year alone. In fact, Masterworks' last three sales have delivered 17, 21, and 33% net returns. And with nearly 600,000 members, Masterworks has been offering a new painting every week, and shares have sold out in minutes in the past. But you can get priority access to their new offerings by clicking the link in the description below. You see, the University of Southern California had done a study on Rotten Tomatoes critics in 2017, and it showed that over 80% of them were white and 78% were men. Now, this whole study was doubtlessly politically motivated. I mean, the University of Southern California is one of the most woke places imaginable, and this was all happening during 2018, when the culture war was in full swing, and Trump had been in office for 2 years, and both sides were looking for more and more targets. And so the radical left would criticize Rotten Tomatoes for being the product of straight white men, and of all of the things, this would end up destroying Rotten Tomatoes. At the time, Rotten Tomatoes protested the study. They said that they chose their critics from generally accepted large media outlets. They claimed the facts was just a reflection on the industry rather than them. And whilst this was just completely true, it didn't matter for their reputation from blue checkmark journalists. So to try and avoid cancellation, Rotten Tomatoes pledged to add 200 more critics to their site, with a focus on inclusivity in the choices. And this meant they added a large amount of critics from niche sites and obscure parts of the internet, all in order to make the sites more inclusive and woke. And so of course this lowered the standards of Rotten Tomatoes dramatically, and little did they know that this move towards inclusivity was the beginning of their downfall. Because after this change, an odd thing began happening. More and more movies became outliers, with audience and critic scores varying wildly. We've already mentioned Dave Chappelle's special and Cuties, but this was really only the tip of the iceberg. Throughout 2017 and 2018, the two scores only got further and further apart, with Rotten Tomatoes now praising woke movies like The Last Jedi, with a 92% score, even though all audiences around the world hated the film for crowbarring the worst kind of feminism and forcing political wokeness on its audience. Captain Marvel also suffered the same fate in 2020, with 79% of critics on Rotten Tomatoes giving it a good review compared to 45% of the general public. Rotten Tomatoes suddenly had a very big bias towards movies with a very clear political agenda. Even if it was a bad movie, as long as it was woke, it was rated highly. And the same can be said of some more controversial entertainment. Anything that went against the agenda was panned on Rotten Tomatoes. Ricky Gervais's 2018 Netflix special was loved by audiences, gaining a 90% rating. But the Rotten Tomato critics suddenly hated it, only giving it again 44%. Although how does this even make sense? Well, simply because Ricky Gervais was threatening the woke agenda, and as a result he was rewarded with a bad score. But this sudden trend didn't go unnoticed. Around the internet forums and posts, memes, everyone was laughing at Rotten Tomatoes. It was just so ridiculous the difference between critics and audience scores. And their reputation would only get worse from here, because on average these critics were starting to give better and better reviews, at least for all the boring trite entertainment, and over time this affected the averages. In 2009, for example, the average rating for a movie was 46%, and in the site's golden age it hovered around that mark. But by 2019 the average had climbed all the way to 62. Were movies just getting better? Well, definitely not. It was because the site's critics were slowly getting more and more positive. Movies and TV shows that were almost universally considered bad or mediocre ended up getting good ratings, whereas actually edgy material that questioned the political narrative, would be stamped with a terrible score. So why was this happening? Well, it turns out that Rotten Tomatoes has a vested interest in giving trite, bland, woke movies good scores, and that's because it's actually owned by Warner Bros. And the ticket company Fandango. After their purchase of the company in 2011, the scores magically creeped up, and apart from the increase in good reviews, it's hard to say what impact this purchase had on the site. But this isn't the only conflict of interest at Rotten Tomatoes. Paul Yanova, the president of Fandango, which partially owns Rotten Tomatoes, began his career and is well connected with the Disney executives. In fact, he spent over a decade working for the company before moving to Fandango and Rotten Tomatoes. And so with so many former movie executives running the company, it's no wonder they started playing nice with Hollywood. But this inflation of review scores is a worrying trend for the platform. If they keep increasing, Rotten Tomatoes is likely to lose the shreds of credibility credibility they have left. The more manipulated these scores are and the higher the scores go, the less likely people are to trust them. When Rotten Tomatoes is giving Cuties and The Last Jedi these great scores and completely slamming people like Dave Chappelle, the public knew something was up. And to be honest, it's very likely that Disney's influence is to blame for the political wokeness that Rotten Tomatoes have been pushing, not to mention them being slammed for being a platform of white straight men. And sadly, this has detracted from the site in numerous ways, be it the inflation of review scores or its new political agenda. And all of this has made people suspicious that big movie studios like Disney and Warner Bros. Are now warping the scores for their own agenda, which is why Rotten Tomatoes just doesn't have the integrity it once did. But to be fair, this all has its reasons. Progressivism is a cornerstone of corporate marketing. It helps your ESG score, and it helps you look like a happy, friendly company. So it's not really a surprise that Rotten Tomatoes had to fall in line. This is standard procedure in Hollywood, and it's why they folded to pressure and hired all those new critics. And yet, the PR that Rotten Tomatoes hoped to gain from the move has backfired immensely. Instead of being praised for taking a side in the culture war, the site has only faced even more problems coming from the other side. There's been so many controversies stemming from films like The Last Jedi and how they performed on Rotten Tomatoes. Fans were apparently leaving bad reviews before the movie had been released, but even when it came out, the reviews just didn't get any better. The same problems cropped up with Captain Marvel and all the other woke garbage like it. But despite the overwhelming negative reactions, Rotten Tomatoes handpicked critics still give them good reviews and high scores. And all of these controversies have been awful for Rotten Tomatoes' public image. And some people believe that this isn't the furthest that Rotten Tomatoes have gone. There's rumors everywhere of Rotten Tomatoes tampering with scores, particularly surrounding movies made by Disney and Warner Bros. And from what we know about their ownership and management, there's definitely a motive there. Whether or not these rumors are actually true, they still reflect incredibly badly on Rotten Tomatoes' reputation. And to be fair, the rumors only crop up because people know that Rotten Tomatoes just isn't accurate anymore. The controversies, the mismatch between critics and the general inflation of review scores have all been awful for Rotten Tomatoes' reputation. What was once respected as a useful way of figuring out the quality of a movie has turned into a politically charged mess. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more controversial videos that I can't release to the public, consider joining the channel. For just $5.99 a month, you'll have access to monthly exclusive videos not released to the public, where you can watch our videos on Ted Kaczynski and our Mr. Robot series review. And soon we'll be releasing a video on the man behind Gay Frogs. In addition to the exclusive videos, you'll also have access to my private Discord group. All you have to do is click the join button below or click the link in the description.